Good morning, everybody. I'm gonna kind of talk quiet here. I'm gonna view in. There's wild turkeys way across the creek over there. I don't think my camera is good enough that you'll ever be able to pick them up very well. I mean, you can see the movement, but you sure can't tell what they are, I don't think. That's so far in. Let me view back out. That's just blurry. We got wild turkeys across there. I wish I was a good turkey hunter. I say a good turkey hunter. I've never actually turkey hunted at all. I wouldn't mind trying it. We have so many turkeys here. Turkey Creek is just across the road. We actually lease the land just across the road there. That's where Turkey Creek is. But we get so many turkeys over here on our side of the road and on the other side. Now of course we get a lot of them. Turkey Creek, the reason it's named that is because there's a lot of turkeys along there. But I noticed that we get so many of them on all the pastures that Turkey Creek is near, that we lease. So all the pastures that we're leasing, we just get so many of them. They love being out there because of all the clover and stuff that we have. But it's not just the clover, it's other types of wildflowers, things like that. That's a sign of healthy pastures out there. You know, you hear a lot of funny stuff people will talk about. I'll try to keep the camera from shaking too much. I'm trying to keep from scaring these turkeys. People will talk about how pastures is so terrible for the environment and for the wildlife and for the world as a whole. And they talk about how we just need nothing but pure trees. But it's so interesting because if you look behind there, that's trees in the back. And where are the wildlife? They're out there in the pasture. And you think to yourself, oh, well, they're just out there right now. They're going to be in the woods. But yet every time you're gone, they're out in the pastures. You know, you set up game cameras and stuff. You see them out there all the time. They go out in the woods to hide from you, you know. And it's not that they don't find food under the cover of woods and things like that. But the point is that there's a huge amount of food in open areas like that. Because forest actually creates a dense canopy that doesn't allow enough sunlight in order to grow undergrowth. Many different types of wildlife, such as deer and turkey and really even other things that aren't wildlife, like goats and sheep and things like that are vital for our ecosystem. Those types of animals require a good dense undergrowth. You know, people talk about, oh, well, you need big trees that are producing lots of acorns. Well, that's fine in the wintertime, but you think about a white oak, such as this big tree right here. A white oak doesn't produce acorns every year. Now, when it does produce, it produces tons and tons of acorns, but it doesn't produce them every single year. And so that's not a reliable food source. But even the oak trees, like, say, a water oak or something like that, that produces acorns more often and produces quite a good number of them. I've seen some red oaks that produce a large amount of acorns every single year, huge piles and piles of them, okay? But that's still only food in the fall. And that's great, that's wonderful, because it helps them to put on fat and helps them to stay warm in the fall time. I think those turkeys, I can still see them, but I don't think you can see them in the camera here. I'm gonna view out some. So that's fine. You can see that that will give them some food and help them to stay warm in the cold, cold winter, okay? But the problem is that's only a couple months of food, okay? And that really 3 to 4 months is maximum, and that's really stretching it. You really only get about 2 really good months of feeding off of acorns, and then a third month of kind of back and forth. But they need that undergrowth. They need stuff throughout the summer. They need stuff throughout the winter. And they really suffer in the wintertime without being able to come out in these open pastures and graze on undergrowth, winter growth. So like winter grasses, cool season things, and things like that. Especially here in the south, a lot of the wildlife here relies on a lot of that winter growth, you know. But one of the things you have to remember is that even during the hot summertime, that whole canopy, and of course this is a pine forest that we're looking at back in here. This is actually planted pines, but we're talking about any forest, okay? And I've told this story before, but I'm gonna go ahead and give you a little story. There was a 100-acre lot, I believe it was. I may be paraphrasing just a little, but I'm pretty sure most of the numbers are accurate, but the story is definitely true, okay? There was a 100-acre lot. Some government officials there, I think it was in Missouri, they actually planted, no, they actually fenced off 100 acres of pure woods. And they put one buck in that 100 acres. They finally had to let that buck out. They had to get the buck out of there because the buck nearly starved to death. Okay. Now, what we learned from that is that the buck could not sustain itself on trees alone. It couldn't sustain itself on forest alone. And that's so interesting because so many people talk about how we need to save the planet by putting nothing but pure trees. And y'all know I love trees. You know, I talk a lot about, I've planted lots of trees in our place, and we take trees down. We harvest trees. We harvest lumber on our place, you know, and we take down junk trees. You know, we had a whole video out here front. It hasn't been put out yet, but a whole video last summer where we took down a whole bunch of junk trees all the way across this creek here, okay? You know, and so we take a lot of them down, but we also put a lot of really good trees that are good for feeding livestock and feeding wildlife back into our place as well. And we're big on that, okay? But you don't want to have nothing but trees. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on in this video, is you just don't want to cover your whole place in trees. You've got to have undergrowth. You've got to have, even in your forest, okay? There are reports that Native Americans actually made about buffalo that would come up into the mountains and into treed areas, and during different cold and storms and things like that. And there were so many of them that they would actually trample and cut out tons of that stuff. They would knock down all sorts of little small trees and brushes and shrubs and all sorts of berry vines and just tons and tons of stuff, undergrowth that was starting to get so high, too high to feed anything else. And they would just come through and trample that. And that trampling effect actually created a wonderful regrowth that was low to the ground and close enough that deer could begin to feed again, and turkeys could start to get food from that and things like that. So it was a cycle in nature that actually happened that was really, really good. Now, one of the things that the Indians would do is they would do burns and stuff to help control some of that stuff. But I've heard it said, I just heard the turkey gobble just now out in the back. There's some big old turkeys out there, guys, big old turkeys. But anyway, one of the things that I've heard said, see, I'm actually quarter Cherokee Indian myself, and I've got some Indian relatives. My aunt, one of my aunts, several of my aunts actually, all of them on my dad's side. But anyway, our Cherokee Indian, and so I've heard some interesting stories because of that. And some of them have told me that one of the reasons for the burns was actually as the buffalo would get killed off, they started to do the burns to mimic what the buffalo did. Now, I don't know that that's true. I have no proof on that one right there. That last part, I don't have any proof on that. I'm just telling you what I was told, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it like that. But my point in saying that is that the wildlife are supported so much better by undergrowth and by sunlight. We've got to have sunlight to gain. Sunlight is what gives you calories, okay? Because sunlight is where you get your carbohydrates and your fat in plants and things like that. And that's where all these, like, acorns are loaded in fat, and they've also got different varieties have good amount of carbs as well. So the moral of the story is that the trees are vital. They are very important, but they're not the only thing we need. We need open spaces like this. We need grasslands. So the reason I mention this stuff, one reason is because I get so many people on my comment section just totally just tearing me down and just, I mean, cussing me out and everything else, telling me that you know, that I'm responsible for so many deaths and, you know, and stuff like that. And they don't ever see the life that's supported on our place. They don't ever see the birds that live here and the wildlife that love to come through our pastures, you know, and things like that. And they don't see, they don't understand the big picture, because all they're talking about, oh, deforestation, deforestation, you know. And all they can see is one. I keep on hearing those turkey gobbles out there in the woods. I don't know if y'all can hear those. They're gobbling like crazy. I'm gonna wait just a second. No, I don't hear them anymore. I think they're hearing me and then they're gobbling. But the only thing they're thinking about is one picture. And that's the picture that they know. The picture of life that they know. And that is how the current forest looks and how they think that it has always looked. They assume that the whole world used to be this huge forest. And it's like, yeah, we've had some places with some forest. But nobody said that they were as dense as people act like they were. Nobody says that you know, you can't, there's no real way to prove that the redwood forests were completely as densely covered. As much animals as used to be supported, wildlife that used to be supported on this, in America alone, you know, it tells me that we had so many buffalo and so many different animals that actually would take these, would actually keep those undergrowth areas cleaned out, and you know, would keep the redwood forest cleaned out from under. You'd have all of that underneath cleaned up, and many different places would stay clean. And so my point in saying this is that we know we had pastures, we know we had prairies, we know we had grasslands all throughout, and we know we had a good mix of trees and different things like that. Nature doesn't like one thing. You know, there's so many different things to take out. Anytime you have a monoculture, anytime you have one thing, and you know, nature doesn't want the entire world to be covered in trees. It's not good for the earth. And people talk, the big thing that people talk about with carbon, I mean with trees, is carbon. They talk about how, well, the trees is what's giving us carbon and pulling the carbon back out of the, you know, and just keeping that carbon cycle going and things like that. And what a lot of people don't realize is that you actually get, if grass is managed correctly, the way that we manage grass on our place in a regenerative approach, if grass is managed in that way, you actually get more carbon, a better carbon cycle, a lot better carbon cycle than you can with trees. Okay, significantly higher carbon cycle, and you can look that up. You know, I'm not just pulling this stuff out of my hat and giving it to you. You know what I mean? You can look this stuff up. Now, I'm not saying all grass. You can't just say all grass. I'm talking about in a regenerative approach where you actually allow the grass to grow high, and then you trample it back in the ground and you eat some. You know, you let your cattle and livestock eat some of it. You know, in that approach, you're getting multiple cycles of carbon being pushed back into the soil, whereas that tree sheds its leaves once a year. Okay, and then it's blocking light. It's blocking life down below. Okay, but it's shedding its leaves once a year, so it's putting carbon back into the soil from the leaves once. Okay, but grass is putting its carbon back in the year when it's trampled, sometimes 5 times a year. You know, multiple times a year. Several times a year, it's putting pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds of carbon back into the soil. And that, we're not even talking about the roots that actually die back off every time this grass right here gets grazed down. When it gets grazed down, a certain amount of that root matter actually dies back off. So the cycle is huge when it comes to grass. So just don't forget that. Don't get too tied up in the deforestation act. I'm not telling you not to learn more and educate yourself. I'm just saying, don't forget what life is all the way around, and don't get so wrapped up in one thing that you know that you're willing to sacrifice everything else. Okay? Try to educate yourself a little bit better. And that's really what regenerative agriculture is all about. You know, it's really about helping to bring the world back to a place where it's best suited for nature. You know, and we actually try to work with nature, and it helps us. It helps us. It helps our pocketbooks. But it's not just about that. It helps our pocketbooks because we're working with nature rather than working against nature. Now, I'm not saying it's all good and all easy, you know, but I do believe that it's one of the best, if not the best, system that we have for modern agriculture. So if you want to learn more about that, check out our channel. All sorts of good videos on that. Like, subscribe, hit the bell.